All right, so this is a super treat, and I'm super excited to hear her. But our next speaker is Amy Berger. She is a United States Air Force veteran and certified nutrition. Yes. And a certified nutrition specialist who specializes in using low carbohydrate and ketogenic nutrition to help people reclaim their vitality through eating delicious foods and showing them that getting and staying well doesn't require starvation, deprivation, or living at the gym. I love that. Her motto is real people need real food. She blogs at Tuit Nutrition, that's Tuit nutrition.com, where she writes about a wide range of health and nutrition-related topics such as insulin, metabolism, weight loss, thyroid function, and more. She is the author of The Alzheimer's Antidote, Using a Low-Carb, High-Fat Diet to Fight Alzheimer's Disease, Memory Loss, and Cognitive Decline.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, can you hear me okay? You can't hear me? Okay, you can. Okay. Man, it is not easy to follow Adam Nally. He set the bar really high, but he set the bar high for talking fast, too. So you're going to have two quick talkers in a row. And thanks, Dr. Nally, also for your service. I didn't know you were a veteran. And thank you for bringing attention to improper thyroid treatment. I don't know if you're still in the room or not, but I'm on thyroid medication myself. It has quite literally saved my life. And I think the way thyroid dysfunction is treated is almost a crime. So thank you for that. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. Okay, we are talking about Alzheimer's disease, and I'm really glad to see a range of ages in this audience, because you're going to realize as we go through this that this is not an old people disease. This is not a disease of elderly people. We should all be concerned about it, and the time to be concerned about it is now. All right, there's good news and there's bad news. So let's start with the bad news, and as we progress through the talk, we'll end with the good news. And for those of you, some of you I know have seen this talk before, and I've been giving this talk almost verbatim for about 2 years now. And that's good and bad, right? It's good because I don't have to make any new slides. It's bad that I can give the same talk verbatim 2 years in a row because there have been 0 new breakthroughs for this illness, 0 new effective drugs, 0 groundbreaking research done. I'm not saying research isn't going on, I'm saying it hasn't amounted to anything to improve this illness. So it's really sad that I can give the same talk. I won't read all of these, but right now, Alzheimer's disease, it's the 6th leading cause of death in the US. By 2050, this is projected to cost the country $1.1 trillion, trillion with a T. I used to live in DC. You know what they say? A few billion here, a few billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. What we want to look at is this last part. In over a 15-year course, deaths from heart disease and many other causes have decreased, while deaths from Alzheimer's have increased this whopping amount. Now, it's only natural that when we're talking about an illness that does preferentially strike older people, that we are going to see an increase in incidence, right? We have the baby boomers, we have a graying population, we have a larger number of people getting older. But something to keep in mind is that we are no longer talking about only elderly people. Aren't we now talking about people in their 50s and 60s becoming afflicted with this, right? Early onset dementia, stuff like people younger and younger. So something else is going on here besides the older age of the population. I'm going to make the case to you today that Alzheimer's disease is a metabolic disease. And when I say metabolic, I mean it has to do with the way the brain uses energy. That's what metabolic means, right? Energy. And your brain is an energy hog. Depending on the source you cite, your brain accounts for only about 2% of your body weight, but it uses as much as 20 to 25% of all the energy in your body, all the glucose, all the fuel. And so when the brain's energy supply is inefficient to meet its metabolic needs, the neurons that work hardest, especially those concerned with memory and cognition, are among the first to exhibit functional incapacity, such as memory impairment and impairment of cognitive performance. I know I committed the cardinal sin of PowerPoint. I have words on slides. Jeff Gerber told me not to do that, and too bad. Neurons are largely intolerant of inadequate energy supply, and the high energy demand of the brain predisposes it to a variety of diseases if energy supplies are disrupted. Although that's a big word, neurodegenerative diseases are not classically thought to be caused by disturbed metabolism, bioenergetic defects are emerging as important pathophysiological mechanisms in several disorders. One of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's is a reduction in cerebral glucose metabolism. File that away, we're going to come back to it big time, but just a little gee whiz info is that this same reduced neuronal energy supply and neuronal energy use has also been identified in Parkinson's disease, in ALS, and in multiple sclerosis and in traumatic brain injury. There was a lady who asked a question earlier about TBI. If you're here, stay here, there you are, because there are so many overlaps between the metabolic problems of Alzheimer's and traumatic brain injury. So, if we're going to understand what the problem is in the Alzheimer's brain, we got to do a little, digging in the anatomy and physiology. This is a basic structure of a neuron, which is the cells primarily responsible for your cognitive function. And the way these cells communicate with each other is that, so you've got this cell body part here, this big part with these dendrites. You've got this long, skinny thing called an axon that ends in these axon terminals. And it's surrounded by this thing called the myelin sheath. You've probably heard of that. Something, again, to file away is that myelin is primarily built out of cholesterol and fat. We need a lot of vitamin B12 to make myelin. We need choline, we need iodine, but we need a lot of B12. And so the way these cells communicate with each other is a neural impulse, a chemical message, is sent down the axon of one, out these axon terminals, and it's received at the dendrites of another. So it kind of looks like this, right? And the space between these pieces don't actually touch. There's a little space between them. That space is called a synapse. You've probably heard some of this at least, right? In Alzheimer's disease, because these cells are not getting enough energy, I know this doesn't look like much. This is a very complicated shape for a cell to have. It costs energy just to maintain this shape. So when those cells are starving for energy, in order to conserve energy, to keep the cell body alive, to keep the main part of the cell alive, it actually sucks in those axons and dendrites like a vacuum with a retractable cord. So instead of these beautiful synapses that look like this, we now have that. Those cells are no longer able to communicate with each other. So it's no wonder that person is having memory loss, is having confusion, cognitive decline, and they can measure this on an MRI. They can see that the actual physical matter of the brain is shrinking. This is measurable. So this is just a real quick look. Here's the nerve impulse coming down, electric being received at the other one. That's the synapse, close up of the synapse. The stuff has to cross that little space. Okay, mitochondria. I have the perfect slot because we're going to talk about cholesterol later, so I'm going after Dave Feldman and before Ben Bickman. This is like ideal. So because he's going to talk about mitochondria after. But if Alzheimer's is an energy problem, it's an energy shortage in the brain, then we're probably going to have to talk about the mitochondria, right? Why? Mitochondria are where we generate energy. There's a very, very small amount of energy produced in other parts of the cell, but the vast majority is produced in the mitochondria. So if there's an energy problem, there's probably a mitochondrial problem. And indeed, if the amount of free radical species produced overwhelms the neuronal capacity to neutralize them, oxidative stress occurs, followed by mitochondrial dysfunction and neuronal damage. Now, real quick, this oxidation, oxidative stress, where is it? I actually think that's kind of getting a bad rap in the keto world. We do need some oxidation. Oxidation happens when you burn fats, it happens when you burn ketones, but it happens much, much more when you burn glucose. When you send lots of glucose through your mitochondria, through the electron transport chain, it generates a lot more free radicals than when you send fats and ketones through your mitochondria. And I mean, oxidative stress is actually a signaling process as well. So there's some, when you do studies that have studied massive mega doses of antioxidants actually have poor outcomes. We do need some oxidation, just like we do need some insulin. We do need some cortisol. We don't want it all the time uncontrolled. Mitochondrial dysfunction and the resulting energy deficit trigger the onset of neuronal degeneration and death. Now, the thing is, it's the failure of the mitochondria to function properly and the resulting energy deficit that's causing these neurons to degenerate and die. But I don't think the neurons are actually dead, and we'll come back to that, but I know we're filing away a lot of stuff to come back to, but they're not actually dead. They're more like sleeping. They're hibernating in low power mode for a while. So, if you're wondering why we have an Alzheimer's talk at a keto event, it's because they regularly refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. And where that comes from is that the predominant malfunction in the Alzheimer's brain is a 45% reduction in cerebral glucose use. Do you think if your brain is using 45% less glucose than a healthy person's brain, you might have some cognitive impairment? You might have some memory loss. You might have some behavioral changes. Probably so. Impairment of glucose degradation may be the basis for synaptic dysfunction underlying the impairment. Remember I said, because the cells are not able to use enough glucose, they don't have enough energy, those synapses are degrading. Those synapses are being lost. Progress in understanding changes in brain energy metabolism during aging and Alzheimer's has grown rapidly in the past 3 decades, to the extent that it is now widely acknowledged the brain hypometabolism accompanies Alzheimer's. Hypometabolism meaning too little metabolism or not enough energy, right? Hypo is low. Past 3 decades. Who's been hearing about this for 30 years? I see one hand, she's like ahead of the curve, you might be a PhD or something. Nobody's been hearing about this for 30 years, but this is not new. This is not new research. This PET scan study where they determined this 45%, 1994. I know that sounds like 2 weeks ago to me, but it's actually a couple of decades ago. A prominent and well-characterized feature of Alzheimer's is progressive region-specific declines in the cerebral metabolism of glucose. So let's explain this in plain English. It's a progressive disease, right? Nobody wakes up all of a sudden one day with severe dementia. Nobody wakes up all of a sudden with Alzheimer's overnight. And it's something that develops over time, right? It starts in a mild form. The precursor is even called mild cognitive impairment. But it's region-specific, right? At first, at least, in this illness, the whole brain isn't affected. It's only parts of the brain, and we know this because you might have some memory loss, you might have some things that you notice, but you can still bathe yourself, you can feed yourself, you can care for yourself. It's only in the very late stages of this illness where the whole brain is affected to the point that you almost revert to like a childlike state. You can't even take care of your basic daily living needs. Reductions in cerebral glucose metabolic rate are associated with increased Alzheimer's risk and can be observed years before dementia onset. Remember when you were in junior high and your teacher used to stamp your foot because it was like the one thing you really had to remember for the test? That's this. This might be one of the most important things in this whole talk. So, remember I said this is not an old people disease, and I'm glad to see people of all ages here. This decline in the brain's glucose use is measurable in people as young as their 30s and 40s. The thing is, they do it by PET scan. The thing is, when people are that young, they're still healthy enough and robust enough that the brain is able to compensate. So even though they already have reduced brain glucose use, you don't notice. They have no signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's. It's only when this process has gone on for so long and it becomes so severe that you start showing signs and symptoms. But by the time that happens, this disease process has already been in place for years, sometimes decades. And I think that's why this can be so hard to turn around, because by the time you even know you have a problem, the problem's already really, really severe. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, type 3 diabetes is such an awesome phrase because right away it tells you there's something going on with glucose or blood sugar. We might not know what, but something, right? Type 3 diabetes. But there is a problem with that phrase because we only diagnose type 2 diabetes looking at blood sugar, right? Your A1C, your fasting glucose, or your response to the glucose tolerance test. There's nothing about insulin, glucose alone. And there's so many medical issues that are driven by chronically high insulin, even when your blood sugar is normal. And Dr. Nally mentioned Dr. Joseph Kraft. Some of you guys are probably familiar. Ivor Cummins is going to speak tomorrow. Ivor is the one that sort of brought Dr. Kraft's work back to the forefront. Dr. Kraft did all those glucose tolerance tests with insulin. Instead of just testing glucose, he tested insulin, and instead of it being a 2-hour test, it was a 5-hour test, and he uncovered this staggering scope of people that had normal blood glucose with super, super high insulin. And in so many things, including Alzheimer's, it's the insulin that's driving the pathology, even if the blood sugar is normal. And so this is the short list. This is the short list of conditions that are driven by chronic hyperinsulinemia, even if you have normal blood sugar. Insulin is a growth hormone, right? My friend Dr. Ron Hoffman said insulin is like miracle grow for your fat cells. Insulin makes stuff grow. It makes your fat cells grow. It makes skin tags grow. It makes cysts in your ovaries grow. It makes the prostate gland grow. It makes stuff grow. So what's the deal with hyperinsulinemia and Alzheimer's disease? Insulin resistance is usually at or near the top of known lifestyle-related factors heightening the risk of decline in cognition in the elderly. They did a prospective cohort study of people that were free of dementia and then ended up with it after a while. And the risk of Alzheimer's doubled in 39% of that sample with hyperinsulinemia and was highest in people without diabetes. This is what we just said with Joseph Kraft's work. These people had normal blood sugar, so they weren't diagnosed diabetics, but they were hyperinsulinemic and they had double the risk for Alzheimer's disease. Insulin resistance may be a marker of Alzheimer's risk associated with the reduced cerebral metabolic rate of glucose and subtle cognitive impairments at the earliest stage of disease, even before the onset of mild cognitive impairment. This hyperinsulinemia is our canary in the coal mine. You can have your brain glucose metabolism measured if you want. You can have a PET scan. You know how in cancer they give you a PET scan with that radio-labeled glucose so they see where the tumors light up on the scan? That's why they do the PET scan for cancer. They do it for Alzheimer's for the opposite reason. In cancer, they want to see which tissues and tumors are sucking up the glucose. In Alzheimer's, they want to measure how much the brain is not sucking up glucose. This is known, and this is something, again, these are things that happen before you have symptoms. The symptoms only develop when this has gone on for so long that it's so bad that your brain can't overcome it. So you've heard of metabolic syndrome, right? Don't worry, you don't have to read these. You've heard of metabolic syndrome. Well, they now have metabolic cognitive syndrome because of this, like the really strong link between deranged brain glucose metabolism, hyperinsulinemia, and the metabolic syndrome, right? The insulin-resistant brain state, a central feature of the metabolic cognitive syndrome. Metabolic cognitive syndrome, metabolic approach for the management of Alzheimer's. Do you guys know Tom Seyfried's work? He's got the metabolic theory of cancer. My friend Dr. Nasha Winters wrote a book called The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. Maybe we need a metabolic approach for Alzheimer's too. All right, insulin resistance, I might have to move quickly. Targeting the insulin signaling pathway during early Alzheimer's represents a viable therapeutic opportunity based upon solid empirical evidence that insulin resistance, Alzheimer's pathology, and related cognitive decline are mechanistically interrelated. We know a lot more about Alzheimer's than we think we do. We think we're totally clueless, it just happens, it's luck of the draw, we don't have any control over it. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions, there's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot we do know. We know a lot more than we are led to believe we do. All right, no talk about Alzheimer's disease is going to be complete without addressing ApoE4. If you've been doing keto a while or you're really into health stuff, you might be aware of the ApoE4 gene, or you might have it, you might have been tested, you might know you have it. The ApoE4 gene is currently the strongest known genetic risk factor for this illness. We get 2 copies of every gene, right? One from mom, one from dad. So people with 1 copy of E4, what we call heterozygous, are at increased risk for Alzheimer's. People with 2 copies, what we call homozygous, are at super increased risk. They have something on the order of a 50 to 90% chance of developing this disease. That is terrifying. But if you have an E4 gene in here, or if you have 2, don't worry. I hope to allay your fears somewhat. If you have a 50% chance of developing it, what does that mean? Yes, you have a 50% chance of not getting it. So what is it that triggers that increased susceptibility? The one thing to really understand is that you can absolutely have Alzheimer's disease and not have E4, not have 2, not even have 1 copy. Millions upon millions of people who have Alzheimer's do not carry even 1 E4 gene. And there are lots of people who are homozygous, 2 copies of E4, that don't develop Alzheimer's. So E4 by itself does not cause Alzheimer's, period, end of story. It just doesn't cause it. You can have the disease without the gene, and you can have the gene without the disease. So what is the issue there? It should be noted that E4 is not an inherently damaging allele. It's only deleterious in combination with a high-carb diet, which is deleterious on its own. Something that fascinates me about the E4 gene is it is hypothesized that this is a hunter-gatherer type gene. This is the oldest form versus the E3 and E2 in the human family. It was really forged in our prehistoric times, not only with a paleo diet, but certainly before the modern diet. ApoE4 is selected against in human populations with a longer history of grain-based agriculture. This gene is not suited for a high carbohydrate intake. And I mean, the seed oils might be another issue, the omega-6, there might be a lot of other dietary and lifestyle issues, but certainly the carbohydrate intake is one of them and probably the most impactful one. This is a hunter-gatherer gene that is not suited for a high carb intake. The ApoE epsilon 4 allele may not, same quote, may not be damaging only in combination with a high carb diet, which is damaging by itself and likely to be a major contributor to the high risk of coronary artery disease and Alzheimer's in populations with or without ApoE4. Remember, you can have E4 and not get the disease, and you can get the disease even if you are without the ApoE4 allele. So if you have E4, if you're eating a ketogenic diet, you're already doing my number one recommendation that I would have for you. There might be more, but that would be my number one. I might not have time, but I'm going to run through this real quick because I don't know if Dave and Siobhan are in here, but if not, if you like Dave and Siobhan's work, you're going to love this. LDL, what does LDL deliver? LDL particle, nutrients, fatty acids, fat-soluble vitamins, right? So they got to get across the blood-brain barrier at some point. So this normal ApoE particles get across no problem. Then we have these little ones with the dot, glycated LDL particles have if the ApoE label is damaged by glycation, it will remain in the bloodstream until it's gathered. Or if it remains in your bloodstream, you're going to have higher cholesterol, and your brain is going to be deprived of all these critical things the LDL is trying to deliver, right? So ApoE, the ApoE particle itself is highly susceptible to glycation, and excess glycated ApoE is in the cerebrospinal fluid of Alzheimer's patients. ApoE4 has a greater tendency to become glycated than the other forms of ApoE. So this ApoE4 is going to have the biggest problems in a high sugar, hyperglycemic environment getting glycated, and if it's glycated, it's not going to cross the blood-brain barrier. So that was my cholesterol nerd slide. Okay, this is a smart audience. What kind of fish is this? Yes, I love it. Okay, it's a red herring. So are amyloid plaques. No, I'm not, they're not a total red herring. We're going to walk through the thought process here, but amyloid plaques are not what we've been led to believe they are. There's a lot of controversy over this stuff. So this is, there's one school of thought, like it's called the amyloid hypothesis, that these amyloid proteins, these misfolded proteins are building up and causing Alzheimer's disease. That's one theory. This is just, schematic of what it looks like. There's all this debris and just protein stuff getting twisted up outside the cells. And so if that's occurring, it makes sense that this might be causing Alzheimer's, right? If we need to have those synapses and they need to be free and clear, if this amyloid is building up and accumulating and getting in the way of the synapse and gunking up the works, well, no wonder those cells aren't communicating. But there's a lot of problems with that theory. So low regional cerebral metabolic rate of glucose is a very early event in the disease process, well before, I already said this, well before clinical signs of dementia are evident, well before cell loss or plaque deposition is predicted to have occurred. The deposition, the buildup of the amyloid plaque is a late player to this game. The very first domino to fall is reduced cerebral glucose metabolic rate. This is the first step. I wouldn't even say it's very early. I'd say it's the earliest in the disease process. The plaque comes later. And in fact, just like the ApoE4, you can have a lot of amyloid plaque and not have Alzheimer's, and you can have Alzheimer's and not have a lot of amyloid plaque. They've done autopsies of people with Alzheimer's disease, and they're like stunned at the lack of plaque. And then they do brain autopsies on somebody who died from some other cause, no signs or symptoms of Alzheimer's, and their brain is loaded with plaque. So this plaque, just like ApoE4, the plaque is not causing Alzheimer's because you can have the disease without the plaque, and you can have the plaque without the disease. So let's see what else is going on. Well, let's go back. They have had numerous drugs to go after this plaque, right? Every single one of them has been a failure. If I were to make more slides to update this talk, all I would do is list every single drug that has failed, the anti-amyloid drugs, and there's one pharmaceutical company, I don't remember which one, and I wouldn't name them anyway. They're waving the white flag. They give up. They're not even going to try to make any Alzheimer's drugs again. That's how many times they've failed and how much money it costs every time they fail. Why are we failing? Probably because going after amyloid is not the right strategy. Every time we go after the amyloid, people get worse. There was one drug where the phase 3 clinical trial had to be stopped early because the people taking the drug were doing so much worse than the people on the placebo that they deemed it unethical to continue. So tell me that we need to get rid of this amyloid at all costs. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. There's another school of thought, there's the amyloid hypothesis, and there's another school of thought that really thinks this amyloid is protective, right? The human body doesn't do stuff for no reason. It doesn't secrete cortisol for no reason. It doesn't secrete insulin for no reason. It doesn't make amyloid for no reason. What is it doing? So this is from Dale Bredesen. Some of you may know his name. He wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's. His is really the first diet and lifestyle protocol that's been shown to reverse Alzheimer's, at least in the very mild stage. Nothing in the severe stage yet, and it's very preliminary, but I think it's promising. The production of the amyloid is a protective response. The idea of just getting rid of it without understanding why it's there makes very little biological sense. I know lots of words on slides. We're going to get to some pictures soon. The formation of amyloid may be an element in the brain's defense against oxidative stress. Oxidative stress may provoke the release of beta amyloid. Oxidative stress is among the best inducers of amyloid precursor protein. That's the precursor to the beta amyloid. The enzymatic release of the beta amyloid from the precursor protein under conditions of neuronal stress is thought to be aimed at reducing oxidative stress, preventing cell death, and promoting neurite outgrowth and regeneration. This amyloid stuff is a protective, reparative, regenerative thing. That's what it's there to signal. Of course, we see a lot of it building up in a brain that is dying. So my TBI lady, we see a lot of amyloid buildup in TBI, probably for the same reason. The brain is secreting this as a help signal. I'm trying to repair, I'm trying to get better help, and the amyloid is part of that signal. So just to nerd out a little bit, because I know you guys are like really advanced and want this, I've been saying all along that the problem in the brain in Alzheimer's is reduced glucose metabolism, right? We're not able to metabolize glucose. One of the party tricks that beta amyloid does is it inhibits brain glucose metabolism. What? Okay, so if that's the case, if amyloid is inhibiting brain glucose use, well, oh my gosh, of course, another slam dunk against amyloid, right? If the problem is reduced brain glucose and amyloid's getting in the way of this, again, the question is always why? Why is the body doing this? Why is the brain doing this? So there's an enzyme. When you metabolize glucose, you start with glucose, you get to pyruvate through glycolysis, and then going through your mitochondria, this enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase, well, pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, PDC, converts it to acetyl-CoA, which goes through the Krebs cycle, and you make ATP energy. Yay, everybody remembers high school biology, or chemistry, whatever that was. Amyloid, beta amyloid, so that's the glucose to pyruvate acetyl-CoA. That's what you need to have happen to fully metabolize the glucose. Well, we need that enzyme working. Amyloid inhibits that enzyme. So amyloid is shutting off the glucose metabolism. Why? I think the amyloid is saying, we talked about the mitochondrial damage, right? And what did I say? The most damaging thing to the mitochondria is the constant, ceaseless influx of glucose, right? We have fewer free radicals, less oxidative damage from fats and ketones. And it's not that we should burn no glucose. You're always going to burn some glucose, but you don't have to burn it from donuts and bagels and scones and lattes and cereal. So I think if I can anthropomorphize and give these mitochondria like human thoughts, the mitochondria are saying, I'm already so damaged from all the years and decades of nutritional abuse that you have subjected me to that I'm not going to let you anymore. You can give me all the glucose you want. You can keep drinking your juice and eating your cereal and eating your bran muffins. I'm not going to metabolize it. I don't care how much you give me. I'm not going to, because it's not like these people are hypoglycemic. They might be normal glycemic, they might be raging diabetics, they might have high blood sugar. It's not getting into the brain. And I think the brain is doing itself a favor. I think the brain is secreting amyloid to protect itself. So here we have this substance that the body is producing, the brain's producing, we see it building up, it's been totally demonized, we want to get rid of every last molecule. If we could just get rid of every last molecule of amyloid, we've cured Alzheimer's. Does that remind anyone of anything? Any other protective, critical, essential, health-giving substance that we've demonized, that we try to get rid of every last molecule of and it hasn't worked so well? Yeah, thank you. So thank goodness, more and more researchers are coming on board with this, what we call the mitochondrial cascade hypothesis, as opposed to that amyloid hypothesis. More and more researchers are waking up and saying, look, Just because we've already sunk 50 years of research into this amyloid hypothesis, if it's wrong, we gotta move on. So the possibility must be considered that current therapies designed around the bulk removal of amyloid may not simply fail, but be actively harmful by hindering the very functionality they hope to preserve. If amyloid is protective and we're trying to get rid of it, no wonder they get worse. Millions of research dollars, private and public, are annually expended on anti-amyloid therapies that do not work and are based on a logically flawed hypothesis. At this point in time, it's no longer unreasonable to suggest that further iterations of anti-amyloid therapies may not be in the best interest of patients. I could not agree more. This was like the best conclusion ever from a paper. The amyloid cascade hypothesis is no longer supported by the majority of experimental evidence. I'm just going to skip that. Again, they're going to fail. I don't have my glasses on, right? Can you, blah, 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 blah. The amyloid buildup does not contribute to primary pathogenesis. Amyloid-centric therapies will continue to fail. All right, now, I said the amyloid is protective, it's really helpful, we don't want to get rid of it. But that doesn't mean it can't ever be a problem. It doesn't mean we want as much amyloid as we can possibly have. Amyloid is still a problem if it builds up and really does block those synapses, right? That gunk does build up outside the cell. Why? Remember, I keep saying we want to ask why. What's going on? What's causing the amyloid to build up? Well, and I've said this is an insulin problem. What's the problem? Under hyperinsulinemia conditions, insulin competes with amyloid, beta amyloid for insulin-degrading enzyme, leading to the accumulation of beta amyloid and senile plaques. This insulin-degrading enzyme, beta amyloid and amyloid plaques are cleared away by a couple of different mechanisms, one of which is an enzyme called insulin-degrading enzyme. What? I always say, I joke that, parents that have more than one child will always say they don't have a favorite, even if they do. I don't pick favorites. Enzymes do pick favorites. They have what we call a higher affinity for certain targets, certain substrates than others. Insulin-degrading enzyme is the parent of many, many children. It's an enzyme that works on a lot of different targets and substrates. One of them is insulin. Obviously, it degrades insulin. When you have a hormone in the body, it can't just stay there forever. Something has to come along and get rid of it. IDE is what gets rid of insulin. Oddly enough, insulin-degrading enzyme also degrades amyloid proteins. Who knew? So but insulin is the favorite child. Insulin is the favorite child of IDE, so that when you have high insulin levels all the time, that enzyme is so busy going after the insulin that it leaves those plaques to build up. It leaves those proteins to accumulate. Holy moly. Insulin-degrading enzyme, a major amyloid-degrading enzyme, might be competitively inhibited by insulin, resulting in decreased degradation. It's been shown that elevated insulin in type 2 diabetes, and I would argue whether you're diabetic or not, if you have high insulin, it induces amyloid accumulation because insulin is competing with the amyloid for IDE, and insulin always wins. All right, running out of time. As much as I've talked about glucose and insulin and metabolic syndrome, metabolic cognitive syndrome, that's not the only thing that feeds into cognitive decline, cognitive impairment. So especially, I know I said it's not a disease of elderly people, but it still strikes in at least middle age and older. So what are some other obstacles, some other problems that might be influencing this process? Probably making it worse in conjunction with chronic hyperinsulinemia. Prescription antacids. These are not benign drugs. Your stomach is acidic for a reason, right? Again, the body doesn't produce stuff willy-nilly just for fun. It produces stomach acid for a reason, not the least of which is to digest protein and liberate the nutrients that are in it. Remember I said we'd come back to the B12 and the myelin sheath. A B12 deficiency alone can factor into cognitive impairment. Now, when you combine a B12 deficiency with hyperinsulinemia, now you're really in trouble, but the B12 deficiency alone, iodine deficiency can cause this. Dr. Nally talked about hypothyroidism. Long-term untreated hypothyroidism can cause cognitive decline. It won't happen right away, but over the long term. So these are not benign drugs. If healthy cognition doesn't happen in a vacuum, you need B12, iron, zinc, vitamin A, B vitamins. We need stuff to make the brain talk to itself correctly. And taking PPIs, taking other antacid drugs, inhibits the stomach's ability to liberate those nutrients so that the rest of the body can get it. And they've done some Observational studies, these do not prove cause and effect, but there are associations between long-term antacid use and increased risk for dementia. And like I said, it's not proving cause and effect, but logically you can see why that makes sense. If you haven't been absorbing B12 or iron or magnesium or zinc, you might have cognitive impairment. I said I was so glad Dave went first. Statin drugs. Adverse information about the potential for generally non-serious and reversible cognitive side effects, memory loss, confusion. This is from the FDA's website, by the way, directly word for word from the FDA. Increased blood sugar and you know why? I have a blog post about this. Statins absolutely increase risk for type 2 diabetes. Maybe not in everybody and maybe not all classes of statins, but some of them do. And there's a reason why. We don't have time. That's a whole separate talk. No, not yet. Okay. The FDA continues to believe that the cardiovascular benefits of statins outweigh these small increased risks. And I always make the joke, except it's not funny at all, but I hope you laugh. You know what this means? The cardiovascular benefits of statins outweigh the small increased risks of memory loss and confusion. Congratulations, Mr. Smith. You've got the lowest cholesterol in the dementia ward. I mean, that is what we are talking about. That is what we're talking about. So this is what they tell the patients. You know, memory loss, confusion, they're not serious. They go away once you stop taking the statin, no big deal. This is what they give the health professionals, again, directly from the FDA here. Reports of cognitive impairment, memory loss, forgetfulness, amnesia associated with statin use. The reported symptoms are not serious and they're reversible upon statin continue. Okay, there's two problems here. Don't tell me it's not serious. When it's me or my loved one literally losing their mind, please do not insult my intelligence and tell me it's not serious. Number two, that's great that these are reversible upon statin discontinuation. How many doctors tell you to stop taking your statin except Dr. Berger? And maybe not always, I don't want to get him in trouble. How many times do instead they say, oh, you're losing your, well, you know, Mrs. Jones, you're just getting older, it's probably not the statin. And you know, do you want to have a, do you want to have a heart attack, or do you want, what's the concern here? You know, we don't want you to die of a heart attack tomorrow, so you better not stop the statin. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not telling anyone to stop it. I just want people to be aware that increased risk for cognitive decline is a major, major side effect of statins, and we know exactly why. Your brain is loaded with cholesterol. I said that myelin sheath is built out of cholesterol and fat mostly. Your brain has about 25% of all the cholesterol in your entire body is in your brain. And there's a lot of there's a controversy over whether cholesterol itself crosses the blood-brain barrier. Even if it doesn't, statins do. Some classes of statins do cross the blood-brain barrier and would impair your brain's own internal cholesterol synthesis. Okay, again, I gotta move, we're out of time. High LDL is inversely associated with mortality, right? The higher your LDL, the lower. Now, we're all gonna die. We all have 100% risk for mortality, except there might be one person that escaped that fate in human history, if you believe a certain philosophy. But no, we're all gonna die. So it's not that we have, everyone's risk for mortality is 100. It just means that your risk of dying of anything but a nice, happy old age at any point in time is lower if your LDL is higher. Non-demented elderly with levels of total cholesterol and LDL in the lowest quartile were twice as likely to die. High cholesterol late in life associated with decreased dementia risk. Findings suggest cholesterol levels within the high normal range are associated with better cognitive performance. This was in a Chinese study, especially in the oldest people. Low cholesterol may serve as a clinical indicator of risk for cognitive impairment in the elderly. We've seen this over and over and over again. The higher your cholesterol as you age, the lower your risk for all-cause mortality, the lower your risk for dementia, the better your cognitive function. And I don't necessarily think that means we need to purposely have LDL as high as we possibly can, but I do think it certainly means we don't need pharmaceutical interventions to lower it. We shouldn't be afraid if our LDL is going up. Praise the Lord and pass the butter. All right, what are we gonna do about it? If I didn't think there was something we could do about it, I wouldn't be here. Hopefully you wouldn't. I wouldn't have written my book. If I didn't think that, if I was just talking the talk, I think there's something we can do about this. Alzheimer's may be similar to obesity, coronary artery disease, and type 2 diabetes in being a consequence of the conflict between our Paleolithic genetic constitution and our current Neolithic diet. So the human brain is like a hybrid car, right? We can run on different types of fuel. And I've been saying all along that this is a glucose metabolism problem, right? The brain has become unable to properly metabolize glucose, so these neurons are sort of starving and withering and shrinking. Wouldn't it be so awesome if there was some alternative fuel? Like if there was something else we could give the brain besides glucose? You're curious. I'm so glad that you're curious. Yes. Oddly enough, I think there is an alternative fuel that we can give the brain. They're called ketones. Maybe you've heard of them. The next quote is from a researcher named Sam Henderson, who's one of my favorites in the Alzheimer's community. It is one of my all-time favorite quotes. Throughout much of human evolution, ketosis likely served as a valuable survival mechanism to fuel brain metabolism during times of food scarcity, and I would argue during times of carbohydrate scarcity, during times of carbohydrate unavailability. Hence, in some ways, the modern diet can be considered keto deficient. That is one of my favorite phrases, yeah. Now, before I move on to my all-time favorite, that's my second, my all-time favorite is coming next. Remember I said about this ApoE4? ApoE4 doesn't cause Alzheimer's. It's a hunter-gatherer gene that is a terrible mismatch for the way we eat and live in the 20th and 21st century. So you've heard that phrase, genetics loads the gun, diet and lifestyle pull the trigger. I cannot think of a better, more powerful example of that than the ApoE4 gene loading the gun and the high carb, high seed oil, high stress, low sleep environment and diet pulling that trigger for Alzheimer's disease. Here we go, hang on to your hats. 2 points are clear. Alzheimer's is at least in part exacerbated by, if not actually caused, by chronic progressive brain fuel starvation due specifically to brain glucose deficit, and attempting to treat the cognitive deficit early in Alzheimer's using ketogenic interventions is safe, ethical, and scientifically well-founded. Now, some of this research is, so remember I said this is a brain glucose metabolism problem. If we had some other fuel coming in, it might not be that big a problem, right? If there was something else. But we don't have, most people are hyperinsulinemic, they're hyperglycemic, they're eating a lot of carbs. There is nothing else because they're not producing ketones. And remember I said the amyloid is shutting off the glucose spigot to protect the brain that's already so damaged. Like, I don't want any more glucose. If we had ketones coming in, that would be fine, but we don't have ketones coming in. This quote from this paper, beta amyloid compromises glucose utilization, but without providing those ketones as an alternative fuel, what is meant to be a survival program, what is meant as a protective mechanism, is perverted into a death program. Now I'm really pressed for time. We're going to have to skip some slides, unfortunately. But feel free to email me. I'll give you the whole presentation, or it's on YouTube somewhere else where I had more time or something. I'm not even going to read these. I'll just talk. You can take a picture of that. I get asked the question a lot, do I need to be on a ketogenic diet to prevent Alzheimer's? I'm 50, I'm 60, I'm 70. I've been eating the standard American garbage my whole life. Is it too late? Do I have one foot in the Alzheimer's grave already? I don't think so. I don't think it's ever too late. That's number one. I don't think it's ever too late. Now I'm talking into the mic. I hope you could have still heard me the whole time. Hello. I don't think it's too late, and I don't think a ketogenic diet is required to prevent Alzheimer's, and potentially prevent, right? I don't know that we know if we can prevent it. I think we can. I want to believe we can. We don't know for sure. But in order to potentially prevent this, I don't think you need a super, super strict keto diet. What you do have to do is eat and live in a way that keeps your blood sugar and insulin within a normal, healthy range. The amount of carbohydrate and anything else that any of us can consume and still achieve that is different. Some people have to be at 50 or 30 grams a day or less. Some people can eat 200 grams of carbs a day and be fine. If we look even historically around the world, we have billions of people around the world that age gracefully with all their cognitive faculties intact, and they're not on ketogenic diets, right? They're eating beans, they're eating rice, they're eating fruit. So I do think, though, if you're already along the disease process, if you're showing signs and symptoms, or you already have a diagnosis, that is not the time to mess around. You want to hit keto and hit it hard, hit some other things. The intervention required to reverse a disease is not necessarily the same one required to prevent it from happening in the first place. And I use the analogy of having an insect infestation in your home. You've got all these bugs, you call the exterminator, he comes, sets off this bug bomb, problem solved. That doesn't mean you had to have that toxic bug bomb in your house to prevent the infestation, right? You could have kept food in sealed containers, kept the windows shut, taken these lower level measures to prevent the problem. Once you have the problem, drastic times call for more drastic measures. It would be dumb for me to say that parsnips cause Alzheimer's disease or lentils cause Alzheimer's disease. I mean, come on. Like, I know maybe we've gone almost a little too far in demonizing carbs in the keto world. It's not carbohydrate per se. It's a whole mix of things. Like, obviously, carbohydrate is a huge deal, but by itself, I don't think strawberries are the cause of Alzheimer's disease. So what I do think is required for potential prevention is a nutrient-dense, low carb, low insulin stimulating diet. Some people are going to need keto, some won't. Kind of running out of time if you just want to take a picture of that, because beyond diet, diet can do a lot, but like I said, the B12 deficiency alone can cause this issue. A lot of these extras I have are just known for being good for blood sugar. Alpha-lipoic acid, berberine, chromium is good for blood sugar. Obviously, omega-3s for the brain. Some of this stuff is a little more esoteric for the huperzine A and the PQQ. MCT oil, coconut oil for obvious reasons, but make your own ketones, and then if you need more, take more, but do your best to make your own inside your own body. Don't have time for these. I want to leave you with the message that I really, truly think there's hope. I think there's hope. I don't know why this type 3 diabetes, brain insulin resistance message isn't getting to the people who need it most, who are the loved ones and caregivers. I have no family history of this disease. Why did I have to stumble upon this by accident? I found this in Good Calories, Bad Calories, Gary Taubes' book. He has a book, there's a chapter called something like Cancer, Dementia, and Aging. And it's the first place I ever heard of the slightest hint of a connection between glucose, insulin, and Alzheimer's. Why does a nutritionist have to talk about this? Why isn't a neurologist talking about this? Why isn't the Alzheimer's, what do you hear from the Alzheimer's Association? Do crossword puzzles. You have a Sudoku deficiency. Come on, you let your brain get lazy. Seriously, that's the best they have to offer us. Do the brain training puzzles. Are you joking me? Why are you not ever even mentioning 1 second of depressed brain glucose metabolism? So there's hope. I think we can do something about this. And I do have books here for sale. I can sign them. If you have questions, there's my website. Feel free to email me. And thank you for listening.